Thank you for checking out Real Talk Personal Finance. Shit's about to get real. Cash Flow King with you today. And today, in episode number 6, we're going to talk about liability management and collateralizing assets. Before we get into the episode today, just a quick reminder, if you would like to submit a question for the Q&A show, feel free to send an email to realtalkpersonalfinance@gmail.com. Again, that's realtalkpersonalfinance@gmail.com with your personal finance related question. Feel free to make up a name. The better the name, the higher the likelihood your question will get read first. Okay, with that said, let's go ahead and jump into today's episode. We're going to start with the first part of this, which is liability management. When we talk about liability management, what I'm really referring to here is anything sort of on the right side of your balance sheet. So if we just look at a balance sheet in its most basic form, you have assets or what you own, and then you have liabilities or what you owe. And today's episode is really about looking at that holistically and trying to approach things from a position of financial strength in order to make the best decisions that we can for ourselves given our individual risk tolerances. And so when I talk about liability management, I'm really talking about how do we optimize our balance sheet for our given situation. Most people, a lot of people, I think, would hear the words liability management and say, oh my goodness, I have debt, I owe somebody for something, I need to immediately focus all efforts on getting that to zero as quickly as possible, and they would consider that to be optimized. And for some people, for psychological reasons and emotional reasons and non-math or non-financial reasons, that could be the right decision. But I think for far too many of us, if we're able to really think through things and lay everything out, if you really think about it, that actually might not be the best use of financial resources of just immediately trying to pay all debt off right away all the time in all cases, no matter what. There's a lot of different types of debt, as we've talked in some of the previous shows, and there's different considerations that need to be made on each of them. So when we're talking about liability management here, again, I'm talking about optimizing your balance sheet. And so step one in doing that is simply taking a look in the mirror and assessing our own risk tolerance. At the end of the day, you need to do what works for you and your family, regardless of what the numbers say. So if there's something that emotionally makes you feel good and allows you to sleep at night, even if the math dictates that's not the best decision numerically, that might be the best decision for you from a lifestyle standpoint. So you need to keep that in mind. With that said, as we kind of jump into the liability management concept, I want to start with the phrase debt-free. Debt-free. When I say those two words, what came to your mind? What are you thinking about right now? Are you thinking about credit card debt? Are you thinking about payday loans? Are you thinking about a mortgage or a car loan? Are you thinking about your student loans? What came to your mind? And for all the different listeners out there, it's probably something a little bit different for everybody, right? Some people probably cringed when they heard the word debt. Other people probably thought, no big deal. Like some debt can be okay. And some other people were kind of scratching their head and saying, is there something wrong with his recording? Why is he repeating himself in such a slow capacity? But the reason that I kind of slowed down was just to kind of make you just take a step back and think for a moment about what is your gut reaction when you hear those words. If I had $1 for every time a client came to me, especially when they're approaching retirement, and said, I'm debt-free, and it's this like big celebration, I can't really say what I want to say, and I have different conversations with clients. I'm pretty much a straight shooter. I kind of tell it like it is, but I can't use profanity like I can on this show, and some people just don't get it, or they don't want to get it, or like I said at the beginning, their risk tolerance and the emotional and psychological impact is just far too great for them to even listen to what I would have to say about optimizing your balance sheet. And so for some people, that is the right decision for them. But a lot of times in the back of my mind, I think, oh man, I'm sorry to hear that. And why in the world would I be, quote unquote, sorry to hear that somebody is debt free? Well, it's because I think for a lot of people, they're not necessarily optimizing their balance sheet. Now, you could make an argument that for one person, an optimized balance sheet equals zero liabilities, no mortgage, no car loan, no anything, and they don't owe anything. And for some people, again, that might be the right answer. But for far too many people, I think it's an inefficient use of financial resources, which is why I would say, yeah, probably, sorry to hear that, probably not the best financial decision, but it may be the best lifestyle decision. So we are going to talk about optimizing your balance sheet, but at the same time, I don't even want to say a close second, but in parallel with that, you also need to think about optimizing your lifestyle. And when I say optimizing your lifestyle, what I'm referring to is the emotional and psychological impact of the financial decisions that we all make. You need to make sure that you're comfortable with whatever decisions those are. And hopefully you can, after listening to an episode like this and just taking some time to really be introspective and think about things in your own situation, you might be able to be comfortable with some of these concepts and also have that optimized lifestyle because you're not overly worried about it. I know for me personally, there was a time in my life where it was debt-free, debt-free, debt-free. That's all I wanted. That's all I could think about. That's all I was conditioned to think about. And that was the message. And the longer time has gone on and the more experience that I've had, I come to realize that that's actually not necessarily always going to be the case. And there's ways to really maximize your financial resources within whatever situation you're in from your financial standpoint and actually carry debt and have it be productive, right? There's productive debt and then there's reductive debt. And there is a difference between the two. Productive debt is going to allow you to expand and to do different things, whether that's a business or certain types of investments, rental properties, for example, things of that nature. And then there's sort of reductive debt that's going to reduce your lifestyle. If you go out and buy a big-ass TV on a fucking credit card and you don't pay it off and you're paying 20% interest and it takes you 4 years to pay off that TV, I would argue that's probably reductive debt. And we are not condoning that type of debt or behavior. But unfortunately, for some folks, that is a situation they may find themselves in. If you look at different types of debt that exist, they're not all equal. So if there's one takeaway so far in the first 7 minutes of the show, it would be that we need to look at optimizing our balance sheet, but also simultaneously, we need to look at optimizing our lifestyle. And in doing both of those things, we need to come to the realization, if we haven't already, that there are different types of debt, some of which is productive and some of which is reductive. And we want to focus on our ability and willingness to look at the productive types of debt. So when we hear the words debt-free, the phrase comes up pretty often. Just because you can pay it off doesn't mean you should. And so if you want more information on how that might fit in the context of your home, I would refer you back to episode number 5 on the power of your mortgage. We go through a lot of different reasons that a mortgage can be powerful. We're not going to rehash that on today's episode. But another example that comes up a lot of times that also would be somewhat, if not even more so, controversial than the last example we went through in episode 5 on the home is going to be that of purchasing a vehicle or a car. And a lot of people out there will be very quick to tell you that a car is a depreciating asset, unless it's a collector car or something that's going to go up in value. Most of the cars that people buy for everyday commuting and just personal enjoyment are depreciating assets, and therefore there's a lot of people that would make the argument that you should always pay cash and never go into debt for things that are not going to help you build wealth. And I would say that I partially agree with that because you don't typically want to take on debt for things that are not going to help you build wealth and net worth. But at the same time, if you look at the other side, I could make an argument that in a way, as crazy as this might sound, and if you haven't figured this out by now, a lot of the things or some of the things that we talk about here on Real Talk Personal Finance are somewhat unconventional because there are different ways to think about things that we've all been conditioned to sort of think the opposite for so long. And that would be there's an opportunity cost to paying cash. Now, depending on the situation, if you went and bought a $5,000, $10,000, I don't think you could find that in today's car market environment. But if you were to buy a $5,000 or $10,000 beater and you took out a loan at 10 or 12% interest because your credit fucking sucks, and you stretched out the payment over 8 years, yeah, that's probably not a good idea. Okay, and you're probably also not listening to this show. However, if you can, depending on the type of vehicle that you're purchasing in the context of the rest of your financial situation, if you can borrow at a very low, and in some cases even 0% interest rate, and then be able and willing and comfortable, that's the key with the lifestyle part of it, with taking those funds and investing them into something that more than likely, especially over a long period of time, is going to produce a return far in excess than the interest rate that you're paying on the loan, then that actually might be okay, depending on how you feel about it. And I'll give you an example from my own personal life. A while back, I bought a vehicle. And I remember somebody asked me one time, it was a fairly nice vehicle, and they said to me, "Did you pay cash for the car?" And I think what they were really asking me was, could you afford to pay cash for that car, or did you have to finance it? And that's where the whole thing, just because you can doesn't mean you should, I think comes into play. And in that particular instance, I actually got a loan. It's a 5-year loan, 100% financing. I put $0 down, and I got a loan at 1.74% interest on the car loan. Now, I value my cash at far greater than 1.74% interest. In fact, I was, again, there's no guarantees in life, but extremely confident that I could take that lump sum of money and invest it at an average rate of return far in excess of 1.74%. So even though I was now going to take on debt, and that was going to go into the liability side of my balance sheet on the right, if we're doing left and right, it's assets on the left, liabilities on the right. I was okay with that because that cash, which was an asset to me, could be converted into an investment, also an asset to me that could produce a return that would continue to further advance my wealth and build my net worth. Now, some people would say, well, that's stupid. How much could you really possibly invest when you're just talking about the purchase of a vehicle, or again, the depreciating asset concept where, that car is going to go down in value year after year after year. Why would you take on debt for that? And again, it's because I value my cash, and I know a lot of other people in the same situation, at far greater than whatever the interest rate was on the loan. So that's what I decided to do. I took out the loan, I added to my debt, but I was able to take the cash and invest it. All right, so I didn't have to deal with the opportunity cost of not investing the cash and just paying cash for that vehicle. Now, could everybody do that? Some people, sure. Other people, maybe not, because there's some other considerations. I was able to do that from a position of financial strength. Fortunately, I had substantial cash flows in order to support that debt or service that debt and make that payment. And also, something else that I don't think a lot of people think about is I wasn't worried about my debt to income ratio. Fortunately, my income was fairly high, still is fairly high, and my debt, believe it or not, was fairly low, and still is relatively low in the context of my overall balance sheet. And therefore, it wasn't doing this and making that decision was not going to put me in a position where if I wanted to buy another property and I wanted to take on a loan or get a mortgage for that property, that new payment was not going to put my debt to income ratio so far off the charts that I wouldn't be able to get the loan. In other words, I could take on the car loan with that monthly payment, that monthly obligation, and still qualify for whatever else I wanted to do if I needed to get another loan for another property or anything along those lines. It wasn't going to prevent me or prohibit me from doing that. That's not necessarily going to be the case across the board. So again, you need to look at your situation if you were considering something like this and really take a step back and say, well, what are my plans over the next however many years? In this particular case, 5-year car loan. Am I going to buy a property or another property or want to get another vehicle or whatever it is during that time period, and how might this new obligation impact me? And for some people, like myself, it didn't. And for other people, that may have prevented them from being able to purchase another property. So that's just something to keep in mind. There's always going to be different considerations. So what we've talked about so far are collateralized loans. So on the house, for example, your home, if you have a mortgage, and hopefully you do after episode 5, that loan is collateralized. Your home serves as the collateral. If you don't make the mortgage payment on time as scheduled, eventually they can foreclose on you and they can take the property back. That is their collateral. Same thing with the vehicle. If you were to get an auto loan in this case, then if you don't make that monthly payment on time and according to schedule, you can have your vehicle repossessed. Again, your vehicle is the collateral. So there are other factors, like your credit score and whatnot, but also the fact that the loans are collateralized, that there's collateral attached or behind them. That means that these types of loans are generally very low interest rate loans. The terms are generally very favorable. That's a good thing because it allows you, again, to expand the asset side of your balance sheet and further grow. As a lot of people have said, you really can't shrink your way to wealth. You can pay everything off and be debt-free at zero, which is fine. And for some people, again, that might be the right decision. But doing that does not help you expand your balance sheet. It doesn't necessarily help you build up the asset column. Yeah, technically you can say that, well, my net worth has gone up because I've knocked out and paid off that debt, and that's fine depending on the type of debt that it is, the interest rate that it's at, and where that fits in your overall financial position. But the point is, just because you have debt doesn't mean you should automatically just sprint in there with a fire extinguisher and put that out, if you can make more productive use of the money elsewhere and you're willing to do that given the financial context. So we'll talk a little bit now about sort of collateralized versus non-collateralized. So we've used some examples of collateralized, kind of what we talked about so far. You have things like homes or a home loan. Your home is a collateral. Car loan, your car is a collateral. Boat loan, God, don't get me started on that shit. Your boat could be the collateral. And no, I don't have a boat, for anybody that's wondering. You have securities, things like stocks, bonds, mutual funds, ETFs that can collateralize a loan. We'll talk about that. Insurance contracts, in some cases, can serve as collateral for loans. So there's different types of loans that are collateralized out there that we've touched on some of those so far. The non-collateralized loans, where there is no collateral attached to it, so unsecured types of debt, for example, credit cards. And that's one of the reasons why the interest rates on a lot of credit cards are through the roof. Because if somebody goes into debt and they buy a bunch of shit they can't afford and they don't pay it off, or even worse, they can't make that minimum monthly payment, it's not like they're going to come and take the big ass TV that you bought, that you've been paying on for 17 fucking years, that is not worth anything anymore. It's just not going to happen. There's no real collateral for them to go after. It's an unsecured loan or non-collateralized loan. They're not going to come back and take the stuff. So to help adjust for that risk, the interest rate is generally quite a bit higher. Same thing's going to be true for, say, a personal loan that you might get. A personal loan is still going to have rates of interest generally that are a little bit higher than, in some cases a lot higher than, a home loan might be or a car loan might be. Again, a lot of this is credit profile dependent and based on your credit score and credit history and, again, the rest of your financial situation. But in general, collateralized loans will have much more favorable terms than loans that are not collateralized. There is a difference between consumption and investment use. So when I talk about optimizing your balance sheet, I'm not saying structure your affairs in such a way that you can buy the biggest TV on the block just because your balance sheet is so robust and fortress-like that you can do that. That's really not what we're talking about. But when we look at expanding our means and investing in more assets, we can look at how we optimize this balance sheet of ours and how we look at the liability management side of things in order to potentially expand. So we're going to run through, I think I have 4 different bullet points here of some different examples of different types of collateralized loans that we might choose to use. And this is going to be different for everybody. I will tell you that me personally, there's certain situations where I would use different types of collateralized loans for certain types of investments. And there's other cases where the same collateralized loans I would not use for other types of investments. And that is going to be entirely up to you. Again, we don't give tax advice. We don't give legal advice. We don't even give financial advice. This show is completely for education and entertainment purposes only. It's for you to kind of get some ideas, some information, some entertainment, and then kind of figure shit out on your own as you see fit. So the first 2 types of collateralized loans are going to be tied to a home, and this can be a primary residence. It can also be an investment property if you have real estate, investment real estate. The first one is going to be a cash out refinance. If you have equity that's built up in your property, let's say it's your primary residence, and let's say interest rates have come down as they have over the past recent years, and you have all this equity that you would rather put to work elsewhere, and the rest of your balance sheet is pretty strong and robust, and you decide, hey, I'm okay with pulling some equity out of this property to reinvest in fill in the blank, that's for you, and that's something that you want to pursue, then you certainly could. A cash out refinance is usually at a fixed interest rate, so you're going to lock it in. The day that you close the loan, that interest on that equity that's pulled out, that cash that comes out, is going to start to accrue, and that's going to happen immediately. So hopefully, if you're considering doing something like this, you have an immediate or relatively immediate need and use for those funds. The investment that you might be choosing to put money into is something that you are going to be able to get involved with fairly soon. You don't necessarily want to generally do a cash out refinance and then have the money sit around for 5 years before you decide to or are able to put it to work, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Usually a longer term perspective is something you're going to want to think about, because if you do a cash out refinance, and assuming it's on a long-term fixed interest rate mortgage, which hopefully that's what you're considering, especially in today's environment, it's not something where you would make an investment and then a certain period down the road you decide to go ahead and pay those funds back in. Not to say that you couldn't start to prepay a mortgage depending on the type of property. If it's a personal residence versus an investment property, different loans are structured differently. A lot of the personal home loans are not going to have a prepayment penalty. Some of the investment loans, especially if they're commercial, they may have a prepayment penalty. We're not going to get into all that today. The point is, if you're looking at utilizing equity in your home and you want to pull out a chunk and you want to take that and do something with it, and you have a fairly immediate use for it, and you're okay with whatever that monthly payment is now going to be after that, right? If you are investing in something that hopefully is producing income, and that income is such that that incoming cash flow is more than enough to service the increased payment on the debt now that you have just increased on your balance sheet, that might be a prudent use of funds. However, if you're going to do a cash out refinance and pull that cash or equity out and invest in something that is not going to produce income or not going to produce sufficient income, then you better have the financial resources and other cash flows to be able to service that debt, or you're just going to potentially put yourself in a really bad position. So again, tread with caution on some of these ideas, because it's not going to be for everybody, and it's certainly not going to be for all types of investments. Personally, me, as you might expect from my name, the Cash Flow King, I am very much a fan of doing this in a responsible fashion, where if you were to harvest equity and pull it out to redeploy it into other income-producing assets, again, that new income stream from that new asset that you just acquired with that cash out refinance, that better produce incoming cash flows that are greater than the amount of that increased debt on that new cashed out refinance mortgage. Okay. And if you can do that with a fair amount of confidence, then fine. And even in my particular case, not to talk too much about myself here, but even if that failed, I have other resources and other income streams that could service the debt. You never want it to be, well, if this doesn't work or this investment flops or whatever happens, now I'm screwed. You don't want to put yourself in that situation, right? So you need to do this from a position of strength, and you need to really think long and hard about it and do it in a responsible way if you choose to do that. Similar to a cash out refinance, but a little bit different, would be something like a home equity line of credit, also known as a HELOC, H-E-L-O-C, home equity line of credit. Usually, the interest rates on these things are variable, although there are some exceptions. There are some products out there that will have a variable rate, but they will let you actually lock in a fixed interest rate on a portion of the amount that you draw out. So you're going to want to check with the financial institution that you're talking to about this. And quite frankly, if you were considering this, I would probably make a list of 10, 20, 30 different financial institutions in your area. I've personally done that to find the best deal. And a lot of places are going to tell you no, or they're going to have terms that are one thing, and the other places are going to have terms that are something else. You want to be able to find the most competitive terms out there, because believe it or not, there's some HELOCs and interest rates given the same person's credit score and financial profile that are going to be double what the other place is. Some are going to be only variable with no ability to lock in any chunk of that at a fixed rate, and other ones are going to let you lock in at a fixed rate multiple times over the course of that HELOC. So you really want to get a sense of what the options are out there in your area. This is sort of, in a way, and I hate to use this comparison because it's really not the same thing, but a credit card is a revolving line of credit. You use it, you pay it back, or hopefully pay it off at the end of the cycle, and then you can use it again. HELOC is going to be very similar. You can use it when you need it, pay it back when you want to pay it back, use it again, unless they shut it down on you, which is another risk. That would be another pro on the cash out refinance. Once that loan is closed, they're not going to come back and ask for their money back. The loan is done. On a HELOC, on the other hand, they can freeze that, they can reduce that, they can shut that down if times get tough at any point in time. So that is a consideration to keep in mind. Also, like I said, the rates on the HELOCs are generally variable, which means if rates rise, that the rate on your HELOC could increase, which means your payment on that HELOC could increase. And so as you can start to see here with the home equity line of credit, there seems to be a little bit more risk here. And that's one reason that a lot of people will generally tell you that a home equity line of credit would be for relatively short to midterm needs, not necessarily long-term investments. It's not to say that you can't do that. It's just that a lot of people would probably use a cash out refinance instead. In some cases, I've seen it where people will use a HELOC to get started, and then if things are favorable, they might do a cash out refinance. And as a part of doing that cash out refi, the lender will generally force them to pay off and knock out that HELOC anyway. So there's different ways to do it, but just know that it usually is a variable rate. It is a revolving line. It usually should be used for shorter term needs. If you're doing like fix and flips or something like that, it can come in handy for certain types of relatively short term needs. The next bullet point is something we've talked about, I think, with Cube Crusher a while back, and that is on margin loans. So these are typically available on a brokerage account, which again is like a non-retirement account or investment account, where you have assets in there, you have securities in there, so stocks, bonds, mutual funds, ETFs, things of that nature, that you can collateralize, right? So you're essentially pledging them as collateral and saying, hey, I don't want to sell these and pay a shit ton of taxes if I've had some growth in this thing, but I would like to get a line of credit against them and borrow some money for whatever I want. Hopefully it's for investment purposes. And I can still maintain those other assets and have those hopefully continue to grow for you over time, or potentially produce income like dividend income, for example, for you over time, and not actually have to sell those assets. You want to double check the brokerage that you have your taxable brokerage account with, your individual account with, on the terms that they might have on some of these margin loans. Some will give you a little bit more of a line of credit than others. There are certain regulatory requirements that they can't exceed a certain amount, but some companies can be a little bit more restrictive than that. And the interest rates will vary by a fairly wide margin. I've seen them as low as 2%, and I've seen them upwards of 8+%. So again, you're going to want to kind of get in and see what that looks like for you. Similar with the HELOCs in recent environments, I've seen those as low as about 3.5%, and I've seen those as high as 7, 8, 9%. So again, you're going to want to shop around and really find, whatever that you feel like the best deal is going to be for you based on where you live and the institutions that you're dealing with and your financial profile and all those sorts of things, to really make sure you're getting a good deal. So margin loans are something else that's available for relatively short-term needs in some cases. And I'll give you an example that I'm actually considering here coming up myself, just to try to put some real-life context to some of this shit, because you're probably listening to this and like, what the fuck is this guy talking about with all these different types of liability and get into debt and use a bunch of loans for investments? Like, is this guy really a financial advisor? Is he crazy? Yes, I'm really a financial advisor, and yes, I'm probably a little bit crazy. But this isn't something that is going to apply to everybody. But again, it's just some good information, I think, for people to just understand. It's not something that I really understood early on. So anyway, as far as this goes with the margin loan, so I had a portfolio, and I'm getting ready to buy another investment property, and I got some cash put aside in the business account for that basically has been generated by the other investment properties. And depending on what I decide to buy for this new investment, whether it's a single-family residence or if it's a duplex or so on, there's going to be a certain amount that I need to put down. There's going to be some money that needs to happen for closing costs and all that sort of thing. And instead of just dipping into my own personal accounts, the plan is to take from the business accounts. There's a separate account that has money in there that's designated for the next rental property that is entirely funded by the existing rental property. So it's its own sort of flywheel. As I like to jokingly say, I make my houses have babies. And so that's part of it. And if that's not enough to cover what I need, instead of going into my own personal cash, which I could do, I instead could go into my taxable investment portfolio. But instead of selling the investments in that taxable investment portfolio, I'm considering taking a margin loan for the down payment and closing costs, whatever I need to make up that difference if there is a difference. And I will, in this particular case, with the firm that I use, in today's rates, which again could change because these are variable, will accrue a 2% interest rate. Okay. Now, I can choose to go ahead, click a couple buttons, get that margin loan, put it with the business cash, use that for down payment and closing on the next property. And then whenever I want, at whatever schedule I want, I can go ahead and pay down and knock out that loan. And then you get into, well, going back to what you said at the beginning of the episode with liability management, why would you pay off that loan at 2% if you can make more productive use of the money, and surely that rental is going to be generating more than 2%? And the answer is you're right. So I may choose, at least temporarily, to not go ahead and make that payment. Or if I do, I shouldn't say make the payment, go ahead and pay back the principal. So with a margin loan, you have to pay interest only every month. But you don't have to, depending on the terms that you agree to. But this particular firm, it's interest only, and you don't have to pay back the principal until you want to. Now, I could use cash flows from that rental to go ahead and turn around and start to pay that margin loan down if I ended up taking the margin loan. And that's one way to do it. I could do the same thing and just pay the interest only portion and keep the loan out. Or I could just say, you know what, it's really not that big of a deal at 2%. I'm just going to keep investing. And when rates eventually start to tick up a little bit and the spread between interest rates and what I could borrow at and rates of return on investments, what I could earn in certain types of investments, start to somewhat normalize, and that spread gets smaller and smaller. In other words, the rate to borrow goes up and up and up, and the rate of return on investments may not necessarily go up and up and up at the same pace. It may stay stagnant, and in some cases it may even come down a little bit. As that contracts and tightens, I can always then choose to accelerate the payment on that loan and pay that off more quickly. But it's a nice way to not disrupt the rest of the financial picture, not disrupt the personal cash, not disrupt the taxable brokerage portfolio, not to disrupt any of that, and simply draw on that line of credit as needed, as long as I'm doing it in a responsible way. Now, if I didn't have investments there in the first place, if I didn't have personal cash, if I didn't have the ability to service that loan payment, and I was literally taking that loan to buy groceries, that's a problem. That's very, very different. It's about intentional use and optimizing your balance sheet as opposed to just trying to pay everything off to zero on the one end of the spectrum, or on the other end of the spectrum, taking on so much debt because you need it to buy a bottle of water. That's not fun or the right use of it, in my opinion, either. So you need to be somewhere responsibly in the middle. Hopefully that helps paint a little bit of picture and clarification on an example there. And then the last thing that I'll mention, and no, I don't personally do this, but I know people that do, is, and we didn't do an episode yet, but we will at some point, on life insurance. For those that may have permanent, so not term, but permanent types of life insurance, this could be some type of universal life or whole life, for example. If you have cash value built up in your life insurance contract, depending on the carrier, you should contractually be able to borrow a portion of those cash values, and the cash value that you have in the contract serves as collateral for the loan. So the insurance company essentially loans you their money. Your money that's sitting in cash values acts as collateral for that loan. So if the loan never gets repaid, they already have your cash values as collateral to repay that loan. And depending on the carrier, you also should be able to generally get fairly favorable terms on those loans. It's going to function similarly to a margin loan where you need to at least pay the interest. If you don't pay the interest, then you could have a situation where a policy blows up, and we're not going to get into that on today's show. Just know that you need to use any of this stuff responsibly. You really need to know what you're doing. If you don't, you should be consulting with your financial advisor or any professional that you have in your circle on how to utilize this. And if you aren't really sure how to do that, or you don't have a professional in your circle and you have some of these products, you really need to be careful and get an understanding of what you're doing. But for the life insurance portion, again, similar to the margin loan, you could borrow, make the interest-only payments, pay back principal whenever you want to. And yes, there's ways to structure this so that the policy doesn't blow up. But if you pretty much take a loan and never pay any interest and never pay the principal back, and you just kind of continue with that snowball, there's some really bad things that could happen with your life insurance contract. So you just want to make sure you understand what you're getting into there. That is all I had on episode number 6 for liability management and collateralizing assets. I hope that you found this somewhat helpful and it wasn't all that confusing. Again, liability management and optimizing your balance sheet is just about looking at our financial resources. What do we own? What do we owe? And how do we use what we have in a productive capacity to grow our overall net worth and build our wealth and build our cash flows. And if we need to use certain types of debt strategically to do that, especially if we can use debt that is essentially by collateralizing our assets, taking out loans with certain assets as collateral from a position of strength and understanding that there still is risk, and our risk tolerance is such that we are okay with that from that lifestyle optimization standpoint, from being able to sleep at night and feeling okay about it, then this might be something that you would want to consider. If that just completely does not sound like your cup of tea at all, hey, guess what? You don't even have to worry about it. You can do a lot of the other things that we're going to talk about on the show. You don't have to collateralize assets. You don't have to worry about strategic uses of debt. You could simply take what works for you and leave the rest, and that's what it's all about. Thanks for joining us today on Real Talk Personal Finance for episode number 6 on liability management and collateralizing assets. This is the Cash Flow King with you. Feel free, once again, to submit any personal finance related question to realtalkpersonalfinance@gmail.com. That's realtalkpersonalfinance@gmail.com. Make up a name, make it a good one, and you may hear your question on an upcoming Q&A episode. Until next time, we will see you in the next episode.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.